Four people beaten to death with steel pipes in a Hollywood Hills bungalow. The killers left one witness alive by mistake, and the man who unlocked the door, the most famous adult film star in America. What he saw that night, he took to his grave. July 1st, 1981, Los Angeles. The morning sun climbs over Laurel Canyon, and a house painter drives up Wonderland Avenue expecting an ordinary day of work. Instead, he walks into what veteran homicide detectives would later call the bloodiest crime scene in Los Angeles since the Manson murders. 4 bodies, skulls crushed, blood soaked so deeply into the carpet it had begun to dry black, and upstairs, impossibly, a woman still breathing. This is the story of the Wonderland murders. A story of cocaine, greed, corrupt cops, a nightclub owner with mob ties, and a porn star whose fingerprints would be found pressed into the blood on the headboard of a dead woman. It is a story that Hollywood has tried to tell 3 separate times, and yet the full truth remains buried, because the only man who could have named every killer, John Curtis Holmes, chose silence and then chose death rather than testify. To understand what happened at 8763 Wonderland Avenue, you first have to understand the world that produced it. Los Angeles in 1981 was a city drowning in cocaine. The drug had migrated up from the disco floors of the late 70s into the studios, the mansions, the recording booths, and eventually the shadow economy that surrounded them. And nowhere was that shadow economy more visible than at the Starwood, at Studio 54 West, at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, and at a small, unassuming club on Sunset Boulevard called the Seven Seas, run by a man named Adel Nasrallah, known to everyone in the underworld as Eddie Nash. Eddie Nash was a Palestinian immigrant who had arrived in Los Angeles in the 1950s selling hot dogs. By 1981, he owned more than 3 dozen properties, several nightclubs, and, according to the DEA, one of the largest freebase cocaine distribution networks on the West Coast. He was a man who kept an armed bodyguard named Gregory Dylas at his side, a former boxer weighing over 300 pounds. He was a man who, according to federal informants, kept kilos of cocaine, bricks of heroin, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash inside a fortified house on Dona Lola Place, high in the Hollywood Hills. And on the night of June 29, 1981, that house was robbed. To understand who robbed it, you have to meet the Wonderland Gang. They were not a gang in the traditional sense. They were a loose collection of drug dealers, addicts, ex-convicts, and hangers-on who shared a rented house on Wonderland Avenue, high above Laurel Canyon. The house was owned by a woman named Joy Miller, who lived there with her boyfriend Billy Deverell, a heroin addict and dealer. Also living there was Ronnie Lee Launius, a violent career criminal with a rap sheet that included armed robbery and suspected murder. There was Barbara Richardson, Launius's girlfriend, a young woman who had drifted into the wrong circle. And there was David Lind, an ex-convict from Sacramento who happened to be visiting that week and who, by pure luck, would survive. And then there was John Holmes. By 1981, John Holmes had appeared in over 2,000 adult films. He was, without exaggeration, the most recognizable performer in the history of the industry. He had built an empire on a physical anomaly and a boyish smile. But by the time he stumbled into Wonderland Avenue, that empire was gone. He was 36 years old, weighed less than 150 pounds, and was smoking freebase cocaine around the clock. He had lost his marriage, his home, his savings, and his reputation. He was stealing luggage from LAX to buy drugs. He was, in the words of one former friend, a ghost wearing a famous man's face. And he was the connection between 2 worlds, because John Holmes knew Eddie Nash. He was, in fact, one of Nash's regular customers, a fixture at the Dona Lola house, allowed inside because Nash enjoyed the celebrity, enjoyed watching the great John Holmes reduced to begging for scraps of cocaine on his knees. And John Holmes also knew the Wonderland Gang. He crashed on their couches. He ran errands for them. He owed them money. And so, in the last week of June 1981, a plan was born. The Wonderland Gang would rob Eddie Nash, and John Holmes would let them in. On the morning of June 29th, Holmes went to Nash's house on Dona Lola Place. He stayed for hours, drinking, smoking, and crucially, unlocking a sliding glass door on the side of the property before he left. Later that same day, 4 men from Wonderland, Ronnie Launius, Billy Deverell, David Lind, and a fourth man named Tracy McCourt drove up to the hills. They were armed, they wore fake police badges, they forced their way in, tied up Nash and his bodyguard Gregory Diles, and pistol-whipped both men. They shot Diles in the arm. They stole cocaine, heroin, jewelry, cash, and most fatally, an antique gun that Nash treasured. They fled back to Wonderland Avenue and spent the night celebrating. They did not know that during the robbery, one of Nash's associates had recognized a face. They did not know that a single phone call had already been placed, and they did not know that they had just made the last mistake of their lives. What happened next has been reconstructed from crime scene evidence, from partial confessions, from David Lynn's testimony, and from the deathbed statements of John Holmes himself. Between 3 and 4 in the morning on July 1st, 1981, at least 3 men entered the house at 8763 Wonderland Avenue. They came in through the back. They knew the layout. They knew where each victim slept. They carried steel pipes, striated lead pipes wrapped in tape, and they moved from room to room with a methodical, almost surgical brutality. Ronnie Launius was killed first, in his bed. He was struck so many times that the coroner would later report the skull was not merely fractured, but essentially destroyed. Billy Deverell was next, killed in the same bed alongside Joy Miller. Joy woke up. She tried to fight. The blood spatter patterns on the wall show she raised her arms to protect her head. Barbara Richardson was killed on the living room couch downstairs. And then there was Susan Launius, Ronnie's estranged wife, who had arrived only the night before, sleeping upstairs in a spare room. She was struck at least a dozen times in the head. Her fingers were partially severed as she tried to shield herself, but somehow, impossibly, she survived. When paramedics arrived hours later, they thought she was dead. It was only when a fingertip twitched that they realized one victim was still alive. She would spend weeks in a coma. When she finally woke, she remembered nothing, nothing at all. The police were called just after 9 in the morning on July 1st by a house painter who had been hired to work on the property. He walked in the front door, saw the blood, saw a body, and ran. When homicide detective Tom Lange, who would later work the O.J. Simpson case, arrived at the scene, he described walking into what looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood on the ceilings, blood on the walls, bloody handprints on door frames, and most importantly, a single palm print on the headboard of Ronnie Launius's bed, pressed there in blood. That palm print belonged to John Holmes. Holmes was arrested, but he refused to speak. He gave a series of contradictory statements. He said he had been forced to watch. He said he had been made to sit on the stairs. He said Eddie Nash had held a knife to his throat and demanded he identify each victim before they were killed. He said he had done nothing. He said he had done everything. He said he could not remember. And in a courtroom in 1982, without his testimony, without a murder weapon, without a confession, John Holmes was acquitted of all 4 murders. He walked out of the courthouse, disappeared into the underworld, and would not resurface until his death from AIDS-related complications in 1988. Which brings us to Eddie Nash. For years, investigators believed with absolute certainty that Nash had ordered the killings in retaliation for the robbery. They believed Gregory Diles had personally participated. They believed Holmes had been forced or coerced, or perhaps willingly agreed, to guide the killers through the house. But belief is not evidence, and Nash had money, and Nash had lawyers, and Nash had, according to later federal investigations, at least one Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy on his payroll. In 1982, Nash was tried on drug charges and sentenced to a relatively short term. In 1990, he and Diles were tried for the Wonderland murders, and the jury deadlocked, resulting in a mistrial. In 2000, Nash was tried again on federal racketeering charges related to the murders, and this time, finally, he pleaded guilty. He admitted, in open court, that he had ordered the Wonderland gang to be, in his words, taught a lesson. He was sentenced to only 4.5 years. He died a free man in 2014, at the age of 90, Farday age of 85. Susan Launius, the sole survivor, recovered enough to testify at some of the later proceedings, but she never regained memory of the night itself. She lives to this day with permanent brain damage and severe physical impairment. She has never spoken publicly about the case in detail. She is the ghost at the center of the story, the one voice that could have named every killer, silenced not by fear or by choice, but by the pipe that shattered her skull. And what of the murder weapons? The steel pipes were never recovered. What of the fourth participant, the man some believe swung the pipes alongside Dila's? Never identified. What of the corrupt sheriff's deputy who allegedly tipped Nash off about police movements? Never charged. What of the drugs and cash stolen from Dona Lola that morning? Vanished, presumably burned through veins and glass pipes in the days between the robbery and the murders. The Wonderland murders occupy a peculiar place in American criminal history. They are not truly unsolved. We know, in broad strokes, what happened and who ordered it, but they are also not truly solved. The full architecture of that night, the exact identities of every person who entered the house, the precise sequence of blows, the words spoken, the reasons Susan Launius was left alive when the killers so clearly intended to leave no witnesses, all of this remains a black box. And John Holmes, the man who unlocked every door, took the last of the answers with him. In the years since, the case has become a kind of Rosetta Stone for the darkest corner of the Hollywood dream. It sits at the exact intersection where fame, sex, drugs, celebrity, organized crime, and police corruption all collapse into a single house on a single hillside on a single night. It is a story about how quickly a man like John Holmes, adored, envied, imitated, could be reduced to a courier for killers. It is a story about how a nightclub owner from a hot dog stand could build an empire strong enough to survive 4 murders and die peacefully in bed. And it is a story about 4 people and 1 survivor, whose names deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in a porn star's biography, but as human beings whose lives ended in terror on a warm summer night in Laurel Canyon. Ronnie Launius, Billy Deverell, Joy Miller, Barbara Richardson, Susan Launius. Remember them, because the machine that killed them, the machine of money and drugs and silence, is still running. It has just changed addresses. If this story chilled you, subscribe to Dark Cases. Every week, we open another file the world tried to close. Hit the bell, share this video with someone who thinks they know Hollywood, and stay in the shadows with us, because the darkest cases are the ones still waiting to be told.